In March of 2011, the Archivist of the United States opened the Watergate Gallery at the Nixon Library. NARA, the National Archives, tasked me to write the text and conceptualize the exhibit. It was going to be such a controversial exhibit that it was deemed appropriate that a historian, and in this case the director of the library, oversee it for NARA.
Welcome to the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. I'm Doug Blackman, and this is the Miller Center Forum. Our program today is a homecoming as we welcome back to the Miller Center Tim Naftali, a senior research fellow at the New America Foundation, but who cut his teeth from 1998 to 2006 as the director of the Miller Center's Presidential Recordings Program before joining the National Archives in 2006. In 2007, he took on one of the most extraordinary challenges in recent American historical scholarship, the task that he is here to discuss with us today. Mr. Naftali became the first director of the Federal Richard Nixon Library and Museum in Yorba Linda, California. Over the next 4 years, he oversaw the release of 1.4 million pages of materials, over 620 hours of Nixon tapes, and moved the 42 million page Nixon collection from the National Archives to the Nixon Library. Building on his experience at the Miller Center, Naftali initiated an oral history program at the Nixon Library and personally conducted about 120 video oral interviews of individuals from the Nixon era. He is also the author or co-author of 4 books on Khrushchev, Castro and Kennedy, the history of American counterterrorism, and George H.W. Bush. His current project is a presidential history of John F. Kennedy to be published next year. As you can imagine, the introduction of a serious, non-biased historian as the overseer of the Nixon Library's presentation of arguably the most controversial president since World War II was no simple matter. Presidential libraries, especially those established while their subjects remain alive, embody one of the greatest challenges of American history and scholarship, a challenge that is particularly important to those like we at the Miller Center who believe history should be a guiding force in contemporary life and governance. And that is how to present the events of the past without veering into a solely triumphal or distorted version of history. Or in the case of a highly controversial figure such as President Nixon, how not to be drawn into a complete dismissal of a man who, whatever his failings, also had accomplishments of great consequence, experiences especially worthy of study at a time when our country is withdrawing from 2 wars and leaving behind shaky democracies ruled by shaky governments with shaky militaries we have only just created. Naftali's role was to impose objectivity and transparency and construct a basis on which the federal government and the National Archives could allow for Nixon's papers to be transferred to California and for the Nixon Library to become a fully legitimate museum devoted to an accurate comprehension of the Nixon presidency rather than a temple of worship or defensiveness. Naftali's stickiest challenge, of course, was the treatment of Watergate. The library's Watergate exhibit, curated by Naftali, is a multimedia presentation of the scandal, the larger context of that time, and of the self-destructive paranoia of the Nixon White House. The exhibit also connects the Watergate break-in to the longer and more elaborate pattern of misconduct and dirty tricks pursued by the Nixon team through much of his presidency. In March 2011, the Archivist of the United States opened the library's Watergate Gallery to extensive positive national attention, the capstone of Mr. Naftali's work in transforming the Nixon Library. And this is his topic today, the challenge of presenting history in a presidential library. Please help me welcome back to the Miller Center, Tim Naftali.
Thank you, Doug. Yes, it's a pleasure to be here. It does feel like a homecoming. I made up my mind some time ago that it would be here that I told a significant part of the Watergate exhibit story. You see, whatever good I did at the Nixon Library, I did because of things I learned here. I was here 8 years, and I learned, first of all, about how to think about public history, think about it in a nonpartisan way. I learned a lot about excellence here. And I learned a great deal about using technology to make accessible the intricate past for the interested but young present. People like Philip Zelikow and then Governor Belials at the end of my tenure here taught me a great deal. And as you will see, Charlottesville also plays a bit part in the drama, if you will, of putting up a Watergate gallery. As Doug mentioned, in March of 2011, the Archivist of the United States, David Ferriero, opened the Watergate Gallery at the Nixon Library. And depending on what costs you attribute to the gallery, if you include the oral history program, for example, it cost anywhere between $500,000 and $700,000 to do this gallery. And it involved the work of a professional museum design firm, Gallagher & Associates, and professional builders and installers and archivists and superb exhibit specialists at the library. But what was unusual about this, I think, was that the writer and researcher for the Gallagher design team was also the director of the library. Now, I wasn't double dipping, but NARA, the National Archives, tasked me to write the text and conceptualize the exhibit. It was going to be such a controversial exhibit that it was deemed appropriate that a historian, and in this case the director of the library, oversee it for NARA. That was unusual because ordinarily the National Archives contracts out the writing of exhibits in presidential libraries. In fact, if you go to the Reagan Library and you look at how the Reagan Library redid its museum, what happened was that the Reagan Foundation, which paid for it, with the National Archives' approval, had a museum design firm supply all the texts and research for then final review by the National Archives and the Reagan Foundation. So it's very unusual for actually a federal civil servant to be writing the text of, now not some exhibits, the exhibits downtown for the National Archives are written by federal civil servants, but in presidential libraries, most of them are not. So that was unusual, and it was going to set up all kinds of tensions that one wouldn't ordinarily associate with a museum exhibit, or most museum exhibits. But you see, the Watergate exhibit had to be different. When the Nixon Library opened in 1991, it was a private institution. And its museum reflected completely President Nixon's thinking about the past. Indeed, the former president, who did not die until 1994, participated in the shaping of the museum of his library. He reviewed and annotated, at the very least, the final draft of their Watergate gallery. Now, what was it like? Well, in an effort to rebuild the disgraced former president's legacy, the private gallery made three big points in its Watergate exhibit. One, Watergate started with a botched break-in. Two, the investigation of that botched break-in it morphed and began to look at other aspects of the presidency because of partisanship. Not because that's where the investigation led, but that's where the president's enemies wanted it to go. Third, the president's mistake was not so much committing a crime, it was to cover up facts he knew in order to protect his men, especially John Mitchell. Meanwhile, that private exhibit made scant reference to the plumbers or to other abuses of governmental power, the ones that made up the House Judiciary Committee's articles of impeachment. And Woodward and Bernstein of the Washington Post were defamed as probably paying bribes to their sources. The exhibit only included one tape, the so-called smoking gun tape, so named because it captured Richard Nixon on June 23, 1972, ordering his aides to use the CIA to deflect the FBI's investigation of the Watergate break-in. When a transcript of that tape became available after a Supreme Court decision in early August 1974, it spelled the end of the Nixon presidency. The president resigned a few days later. The old library gallery included that tape, indeed, but it also included some heavy-handed commentary to lend the impression to the person listening to the tape that what you're actually hearing didn't actually happen. But it wasn't just an exhibit that was in a vacuum. And this is where the real challenge arose, I think. It was embedded in an environment, that can be best explained in two ways. One, the coat of arms of the city of Yorba Linda, California, where the library is located, mentions that it is the birthplace of Richard Nixon. Secondly, when I took over, when the National Archives became responsible for this library, we inherited the museum, of course, but the museum had a couple of exhibit spaces that could be changed, easily changed. You can change the permanent gallery, it's just much more expensive. And the first temporary gallery had a show about the funerals of President and Mrs. Nixon. They had been dead since 1993 in Mrs. Nixon's case, 1994 in the President's case. This exhibit was at least 5 years old, and it was an exhibit with huge pictures of the caskets and of people standing, paying their respects. It included the jacket the President wore when he suffered his fatal stroke. It included the wristband that he had worn in the hospital. It included stuffed animals that had been left by the library in memorial. Not only did it symbolize a great sense of despair at the loss of the president, but a number of the people depicted in the pictures either standing in line to pay their respects to Richard Nixon or serving as volunteer docents to help people around where the president lay in state, still worked at the library. They were part of the 175-strong docent guild. So you would have to change the story of the president's greatest failure in an environment of reverence for a hometown hero. That was a challenge, and it required a lot of sensitivity. In short, what we had there, therefore, was an Alice in Wonderland exhibit in a shrine tended by the faithful. The Watergate exhibit had enough truth to allow polemicists to say that it was truthful, but that truth was so badly mangled as to give the opposite impression to what had actually occurred. The library had about 100,000 visitors a year, and most importantly, at least from my perspective, it also had 10,000 school kids. Imagine, if you think about those of you young enough to have been in high school in the last 10 to 15 years, if you think about how hard it is for high school teachers to bring you up to the present in your U.S. history class, imagine if the only history that local school kids learned about Watergate was the history that I just laid out for you. And what did they learn? Because I told you the 3 big points, but what were the 2 big takeaways that the kids had when they left visiting this library in that era? 1, all presidents break the law. Richard Nixon's only unique crime was to have gotten caught. He was the victim of a double standard that John F. Kennedy did not have to live up to. 2, the U.S. system of government is weak and can be easily hijacked by partisan forces. The president should never have had to resign, but the Democrats wanted to undo the electoral verdict of 1972. Now, I can't imagine a better way to inculcate a dislike of government and public service in young people than to have an exhibit that makes those cases. But that was a private library, and they had every right to do what they wanted with Bibi Rebozo's money. But suddenly, this was now your money. And you are not all Republican, and you're not all Democrats, and some of you don't vote at all, but you pay taxes anyway. Your library couldn't possibly have this approach, could it? And be public? Well, that was the challenge. It was, if you will, a debate between civic literacy and civic religion. Do you want to pay for civic religion, defined by localities, where some presidents are popular in some areas more than in others? Thomas Jefferson? Or do you want your tax dollars to go to help kids understand how our system of government works, how our Constitution works, its strengths and weaknesses, and have the freedom to make up their own mind and speak it? What do you want your tax dollars to do? Well, that's easy, huh? Over 10 years ago, Julie Nixon Eisenhower decided, she encouraged the foundation, I wasn't there at the time, I was actually here, encouraged the foundation to get a lobbyist to change a very important law so that her father's library, she didn't use this term, but this is how I always thought of it, her father's library wouldn't be the Roger Maris Library anymore. If you remember that really good show called the 61 Asterix, about Roger Maris and how he beats this record, but he's never really just one of the gang. The Richard Nixon Library wasn't one of the gang because it didn't have documents. The Watergate, as a result of Watergate, Congress changed the way in which our government deals with presidential records, I think in a very good way. This often surprises people, but up to Richard Nixon, presidents owned their papers. They could do what they wanted. They could destroy them. In fact, a number of them did. That also meant they owned their tapes. And indeed, before Alexander Butterfield revealed the fact that Nixon taped, the public didn't know that LBJ taped, or that Kennedy taped, or in fact that presidents taped right back to Roosevelt, something that we spent a lot of time here working on and still work on very well under David Coleman and a great group. Anyway, imagine if your president could destroy whatever he, and I hope someday she, wanted to. Imagine that. That was the law of the land. They could. And what they would do is they would, at the end of their presidency, if they were lucky enough to live to the end of their presidency, I mean, obviously Kennedy didn't, but they would then give the papers to the US government, they would deed them and get a tax write-off. And they would set up a system by which their representatives could oversee how the material came out. So there were strict controls. Richard Nixon assumed that he would have this kind of control over his papers and over his tapes. So in this, he was not different. In this, he was not being unique. But he lost control over his papers and his tapes, partly because he tried to cut a deal that would have allowed him to destroy his tapes within 5 years. Congress stepped in, seized everything, and it was like a crime scene. Things, file cabinets were seized, things were closed. And I mean this because one of the residual responsibilities for the director of the library is that there are things that we captured that the US government shouldn't have. Baby pictures, Super 8s of child's birthday parties, so all kinds of things that were personal that were in people's desks that the US government just swooped up and picked up because Nixon had tried to put himself in a position to destroy materials. And the law, the Presidential Recordings and Materials Preservation Act of 1974, signed by Gerald Ford, stipulated that these materials could not leave the vicinity of the District of Columbia, the general area around the District of Columbia. Well, you couldn't have a presidential library because you couldn't move them to California. Congress changed the law and in 2004. And then there were negotiations. And the Nixon Foundation made a tactical error. They were supposed to host a Vietnam conference, and they didn't. And there was such backlash among scholars that the National Archives negotiated an agreement with the Nixon Foundation, which resulted in the Nixon Foundation promising to hand over materials that Richard Nixon had won in the courts in the 1990s. And this is where we get to Watergate, the Nixon Foundation promised to redo their exhibit before the National Archives got there. Let me make this clear. The Nixon Foundation was going to redo it, not the National Archives. National Archives did not want to touch this hot potato. Well, here's what happened. When I come on the scene, the Nixon Foundation has spent a year trying to think about it. They don't know how to do it. They couldn't redo the exhibit. Why? Makes perfect sense, actually. Nixon was dead. He had okayed the previous text how do you change the liturgy? How do you revise the president? Nobody wanted to revise the president. So when I'm offered the job as director, they also say to me, and you're going to do the new Watergate exhibit. Both the foundation said this to me and the National Archives. Here. Well, I'd never done an exhibit before. I'd done digital exhibits because I'd learned great things here at the Miller Center about posting things online. But I'd never done a physical exhibit. But what the heck? Why not try? I was not a Nixon specialist, but it made me think about how to deal with a difficult subject. And I had been here when Monticello had changed its approach to Sally Hemings. And I had seen how responsible adults, in a transparent way, let good history change their narrative. I wanted the same thing to happen out there. I wanted to find a way that that community could embrace a difficult and different narrative about Richard Nixon and Watergate. So how was I going to do it? Because I had worked with Jim Young, Russell Riley, I'd done some oral histories here. I thought what I would do is I would create video oral histories and let the Nixon people tell their own story. I knew that they had changed their minds. I'd watched enough shows on the Discovery Channel and on the History Channel to know that as they got older, they had come to terms with the fact that they had done wrong. I thought, let them say it. Why have this? I was fearful, having spent 8 years here and having studied American history, I didn't want to be a carpetbagger. The last thing I wanted was for the big bad federal government in General Grant to come down there, or Sherman, whoever you want to choose, and impose history on them. I wanted them to learn from their friends. So I made a point of interviewing Republicans, and I mean, like Trent Lott, Senator Lott, who had been on the House Judiciary Committee, who had changed his mind and decided that he would vote for impeachment. Chuck Colson, I did 2 interviews with the now late Chuck Colson. I went out, I interviewed them on camera, and then I interviewed Democrats and people who were neither Democrat nor Republican who had played roles as investigators, the prosecutors. And finally, I even got a chance to interview a Supreme, Stephen Breyer, Justice Breyer. I wanted all 3 branches of our government to be represented, and I wanted kids to learn about how government worked. And then I was going to put it on screens, and you were going to make up your own mind about what happened. And so I made the Nixon Library was the first library to be wireless, to have wireless, because I had an idea that I would have a multimedia server, and we'd pull this stuff up from the basement, and you could decide what you wanted to learn. It was a grand, big idea. All right, well, I made 2 assumptions that were wrong. My first assumption that was wrong was that the Watergate story was established, and that these oral histories I was doing would be like the illuminations in an illuminated manuscript. And I'm going to tell you how I was wrong about the Watergate story. And the other thing I got wrong was that you have to have narrative. It's not enough to make it a science project. You actually have to give people a narrative. You have to give them a timeline. You actually have to have topic sentences. Listen, I write books. I know all about topic sentences. But I was a public historian, and I thought, I am now a federal officer. How dare, I can't, I'm not the voice of God. I wasn't the voice of God before, by the way. But I mean, definitely, because what you had in that museum was the voice of God. It was Richard Nixon's voice. Were we going to replace Richard Nixon's voice with, God forbid, mine? Well, all right, first thing, and I have to do this quickly. I'm going to give you snapshots of the story because it's a long one and we don't have the time, but we have a Q&A session coming up. But I want to get at a couple of big ideas. One idea is that sometimes the things we think we know, well, we don't, for all kinds of reasons. But I'm going to tell you about Watergate. One, One of my first interviews was with a guy named Dwight Chapin. Dwight Chapin had gone to jail for lying about a dirty tricks operation. Dwight Chapin did as I had hoped they would do. He decided to unburden himself. I also did something else. I wanted to be sure that these oral histories were not owned by a private organization, but were owned by the government of the United States, and there was to be no editing. I had people sign their release before they did it, much as I signed my release before I did this today. And so we just let the film run. I did this because I had experienced here with the President's Recordings Program that we would want to get tape of interviews that the Kennedy Library did because we wanted to do voice identifications. And the Kennedy Library wouldn't let us have the original tapes because the document was actually the edited transcript, not the tape. Well, I didn't want the document to be a transcript. I wanted the document to be the video because it was going to be public domain. And it's so hard to get public domain video. So the only way to do that was to make sure, and the lawyers helped me, that the actual document was the video and that couldn't be edited, except for reasons of national security or privacy. But that's something at least the National Archives would control and follow strict guidelines. Okay. Well, he unburdens himself. And he says, you know, I have to tell you that, you know, the Dirty Tricks campaign, you know. Then he tells the story of how Richard Nixon actually ordered it. Well, he denied under oath that Richard Nixon had been involved. But in front of the camera, he said, you know, Haldeman invited me into his office, or he invited me into an office. The Richard Nixon president was sitting right next to Haldeman. And Haldeman said, you know, and they started talking about dirty tricks and would I do it, and ultimately he hired a fellow named Segretti, and the president was just there. So he knew all about it. Whoa. Oh, that's interesting. That's going to make for an interesting clip. I went back to the library, and the head of the Nixon Foundation said, by the way, you just interviewed Dwight Chapin. He didn't happen to tell you da-da-da-da, because Chapin had said it in a Nixon Foundation interview, which never saw the light of the day. I said, yeah, you said that. He said, well, you're not going to use it, are you? Well, I said, I'm going to use it if I can corroborate it. I won't hang an argument on it, but, well, you're not going to use it unless you can prove it. I'll make sure you can't use it. Oh. I thought I was running this show. And so I started to look for evidence, which started me into a year and a half, because I was running the library. I didn't have full time for this, operation of listening to tapes. And I found other corroborated evidence that the president knew about the Dirty Tricks campaign, and I used that. And the Dwight Chapin clip isn't quite where I wanted it in the exhibit, but it's in the exhibit. It's in the side part of the exhibit. And it's online, more importantly. Anyway, so I realized, oops, these oral histories can actually not create history, but add new details. Second point, when the National Archives negotiated with the Nixon Foundation said, we will give you the materials the president received through the courts that were deemed political. The courts decided that if Richard Nixon was speaking as a father or a member of the Nixon family, that material was properly private, of course. And that was not, not to be released. Well, I think presidents deserve some privacy. But the court also decided that when the president spoke as the head of the Republican Party or participated in discussions about politics, those also belonged to him as private property. So the Nixon releases, before I got there, the tapes had whole sections removed. And it also had a very devastating effect on documents, particularly domestic affairs documents. Have you ever wondered why it took so long for the domestic side of the Nixon administration to get out? It's because so much of that stuff was intermingled with politics, because imagine domestic policy and politics being together. Well, I wanted, when the library opened, that one of the things we showed the public, because a lot of scholars were skeptical that this whole enterprise was a good idea. I wanted them to see immediately the materials the National Archives had negotiated for, 78,000 pages. And I looked at them because I knew I was working on Watergate. I looked at them before we opened them. And I really sat in the research room and I went through them and I discovered, oh my God. The National Archives had inadvertently, I think, given to the Nixon Foundation in the 1990s, and by the way, they could have the Nixon Foundation could have destroyed it, the only documentary record that Haldeman, the best documentary record that Haldeman's aide had been told that the G. Gordon Liddy political espionage operation had been approved by Mitchell. That would have been destroyed. The National Archives gave this to the Nixon Foundation in the 1990s because, I don't know why, I'm not going to impute motives, but I can tell you the handwritten notes of Haldeman's aide, he testified to this, but there was no document because, of course, the Senate couldn't get access to these documents. That, and there was a bunch of material. I thought, oh my God, scholars have never seen this. The National Archives gave this away. And then, later in 2007, because I became very skeptical of how these materials had been managed, we were going to release the documents of the president's lawyer, Fred Buzzard. And, you know, I'm not an archivist, I'm not trained, I had archivists, I oversaw them. I asked to see everything that they were withholding. I had a right to, I had the appropriate rights to do this. And so they took me to the vault. I was always careful in the beginning of my job there not to walk through the vault for no reason. I mean, I had to have a reason. And I went into the vault. This was not the National Security Vault, the other one. It's not classified material, but it was closed, confidential material. And I looked on the wall and I saw Colson, Dean, Haldeman, 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 Ehrlichman, Haldeman, Haldeman, Ehrlichman. Boxes and boxes. I said, what's this stuff? We don't know, because there was no institutional memory. When I came to the library, there was no plan for processing the tapes, or because there had been a struggle in the National Archives over whether there should be a Nixon Library or not. And so the whole system was up to me. I mean, I'm the one who chose what would be processed, what would be done, who would do what. They left it sort of in my lap. And I said, what's this stuff? And they said, we don't know. So I opened the boxes and I started to read the material. And I realized that this was Watergate-related material that had been improperly withheld from the people of the United States in the 1990s as a product of the fight with the Nixonians. I can't impute motives. I don't know why the National Archives did it, but I can tell you this was material about the investigation of Jews in the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This included material about paying for ambassadorships. This included material about political espionage, about hiring people to follow Ted Kennedy. And I think the most important, there were many important documents, but the most important from my perspective, the only record of Richard Nixon ordering the enemies list had been denied to the public. I found it in a box. It was Haldeman's notes of a meeting on June 23rd, 1971. And the tapes had spooled out, so there's no tape of this. It's an hour and a half of a conversation for which we had no other record. Haldeman had talked about it that night, but it's not a contemporaneous record. This is the only contemporaneous record of the issuing of the enemies list. This is really important because Richard Nixon, under oath, had denied any role in the enemies list when he was put under oath after leaving the presidency. The Special Prosecutor's Office did not have access to this material. Richard Nixon committed perjury. He actually could have been charged because his pardon did not include offenses committed after leaving office. But he actually, under oath, committed perjury. And this document proved it because he had ordered the enemies list. This material was closed in our vault. So I realized that this exhibit, if it had to be true and honest, would have to include materials that had never been open to the public before. This made this exhibit much more complicated. So if you look at our website, or what was our website, the Nixon Library's website, you'll see a bunch of stuff that's Watergate-related coming out in 08, and 09, and 10. That's because I decided, we set up a very professional system of reviewing this material. I decided that I wouldn't use this material, it would be a gotcha game, in an exhibit if the public hadn't already seen it. More importantly, if the Nixon Foundation hadn't already seen it. So a lot of new Watergate materials came out in 08, 09, and 10 because they'd been locked away in our vault by mistake in the 90s. Not by the people I was working with. This is a different I was working with a different generation of archivists. All right. So what happens? I present this highly interactive, do-it-yourself Watergate exhibit in 2009, and I present it to my colleagues. And they look at it, these are the other library directors, and they don't get it. And they're smart people. It's just too complicated. They said it's great if you're a graduate student, but it's just too, I mean, basically, I removed the central focus because I thought the federal government probably shouldn't tell people what to think. The evidence is overwhelming of abuse of government of power, and I used tapes and transcripts. But everybody wanted a narrative. So I said to them, you want a narrative? You get a narrative. And starting in 2009, it changed. Washington found money, hired a design firm, asked me to write the narrative. And then I was in this position of actually now taking all this stuff, some of which was new, and turning it into a new approach to understanding Watergate. Absolutely the kind of challenge a historian loves to have. Whether a public historian who's also running a library in a highly contentious environment wants that, well, I took it anyway. And the last couple of things I want to mention before we open this to questions was the politics of this whole experience, because I'm describing the part that was fun. And by the way, it is a privilege to work for the government, and I cannot express how happy I am that I got to participate with professionals in opening materials to the public, and they're forever. Now I'm going to talk about the part that wasn't so much fun, which was how this thing was going to go from my work table to the wall, rather than me going to the wall. And the National Archives had, and this is why the uniqueness is important, National Archives had never put a major exhibit in a presidential library before that did not have the support of a foundation. This had never happened before. And I was fearful of an Enola Gay experience, where the outcome would be nothing. Just the exhibit with no text, in the case of a plane, if you will. So I worked out with my boss, Sharon Fawcett, a way to approach the foundation with the exhibit done, but in draft form, for their comments. Now, I thought it was useful for them to comment because I could have made mistakes. I mean, I did this. I mean, I had a lot of people look. I had colleagues and interns look at it. And I was going to, and I'll tell you the other person I had look at it. But I mean, you know, I could have made a mistake. More importantly, I wanted them to have a chance, if they had evidence that they had not shared with me or anybody else, that I would know about it. I didn't want to be the victim of a gotcha. But I didn't want them to have a lot of time, but I wanted them to be able to do this. I also showed the draft to a Watergate historian. I shared it with Stanley Cutler. He is the dean of Watergate historians. He's also the person responsible for the tapes having come out. And it was important to me that a great Watergate historian be able to tell me if I'd messed up. So I showed it to him after showing it to the foundation. My bosses approved the first draft, which included multimedia. I used clips of interviews, and then the storm. I wasn't surprised that the Nixon Foundation didn't like it, but the storm was astounding. They demanded more time. They set up a whole team, which they called Team Searchlight. The president's Secret Service name was Searchlight. And it included a former felon, this man, Dwight Chapin, who had flipped. He wasn't denying what he had told me. Now he just wanted to be sure that what he told me didn't find its way into the exhibit. And members of the president's advance team and people who had worked on his memoirs. They were arrayed against me. I didn't mind, because I had the evidence on my side, but And what I did for them was I created illuminated footnotes. And you can see those footnotes. They're on the Nixon Library website. Every document was scanned that was essential to an argument. Clips, tapes, they're all there. I did this for them so that they could, because I knew Washington didn't know the story, so that Washington would have confidence and that they would have a chance to see if there were any errors. They found one date of a subpoena that I had wrong, but they found no substantive errors. So they made a different kind of argument. This kind of exhibit can't be in a presidential library. No other presidential library has anything like this. Where's the blue dress in the Clinton library? The president, you don't talk about the crimes that John F. Kennedy committed against his use of the IRS. You don't mention this, you don't mention that, you don't. Well, this wasn't the John F. Kennedy library. And I'll leave it to, and I'm working on Kennedy now, and if I find that kind of evidence, I will use it, of course, in my book. But the fact of the matter is, the arguments were not anymore, wasn't about evidence, because they couldn't say anything about the evidence. And I asked them, because I met with them, and I said, have you listened to the tapes that the National Archives put out in the 1990s, the so-called abuse of government power, or late 90s and early part of the century? They hadn't. But they didn't care, because their argument was not about evidence. It was about what's the appropriate use of a library. And they said it's civic religion. We want Americans to love presidents, and Richard Nixon should be loved like every other president. He deserves that. We don't care. And so this was a huge struggle. Now, I recommended to the National Archives in Washington that they get a panel of independent scholars to basically balance the Nixon Foundation. I said, look, I am now tainted. I am now a federal civil servant. That's not being tainted, but in the case of this debate, I am now sort of a state historian. You get some outside historians. I didn't care. I knew that outside historians, the evidence was very clear, that they would be supportive. Now, they might find mistakes. That's fine. We learn from colleagues. But it would counterbalance and give the National Archives the opportunity to push back against the Nixon Foundation, because right at that point, you had an intensity gap. You had me, and you had the Nixonians, and their intensity was ferocious, because they were defending themselves. It was no longer about the president, it was themselves. And the reason Charlottesville figures in this story is that Washington was divided over what to do. And ultimately, the archivist of the United States, the top guy, did the right thing. But before he did the right thing, some not so right things were done. And one of the things was that my boss was so nervous about this, she called it a train wreck, that in Charlottesville, over drinks, she and the head of the Reagan Foundation offered me a deal. And the deal was, if I would resign, I would get my exhibit. And that they wanted me to resign, and they wanted to give my head to the archivist of the United States on a platter, and this would be what the Nixonians, maybe the Nixonians would stop pushing. I thought this was outrageous. But I couldn't have a temper tantrum. So I listened to them. I said, well, how would you do this? And what about my staff? What about the effect on morale? How would you explain this? Would you explain that I'd done a bad thing? What kind of precedent would this set for other directors? How could you run the Nixon Library in the future if the Nixon Foundation learned that if they put enough pressure, the director is out? No answer. Tim, this is the only way your Watergate exhibit is going to happen. You've got to resign. So I didn't, of course. What I did was I protected myself, and more importantly, I protected the exhibit. Because I came to the conclusion that the only way the exhibit wouldn't happen was if all this happened in secret. I knew that there was support in the public sphere for real history, but the public had to know that real history was actually imperiled. And so, I had never been told I'd always been allowed to run my own press campaign. I was not illegal. I had run the press because I was rebranding the library. And a number of opportunities arose for me, and people knew that, that the Nixon Foundation was analyzing this draft. And I just made it clear that, it's not clear how this is going to go. And that was very helpful. There was an editorial in the New York Times supporting the National Archives in defending history. But it still wasn't over. So the opponents of this exhibit in Washington came up with a different strategy. I wasn't going to resign, so what we're going to do was a typical Washington approach, which was to put a panel together. Panel was put together to look at my draft and look at the Nixonian response. And I thought I was done. I expected to be fired. And I went to Washington in August, I was surprised when the Archivist of the United States, who turns out to be a very good guy in this whole story, says to me, no, you're the curator. You stay the curator. I want you, you're going to finish it. You started, I like it. I liked it in April. I like it now. You stay. Just work with the panel. Then I met with the panel. And the panel handed me a new exhibit in outline. The foundation had asked that the exhibit no longer start with the Pentagon Papers and the plumbers. The panel suggested that the exhibit no longer start with the Pentagon Papers and the plumbers. The foundation had asked that all the oral histories be stripped from the exhibit. The panel suggested the oral histories be clumped in the back of the exhibit in an area called Voices of Watergate, no longer being used to amplify elements. The foundation had wanted to remove the segment on the building the list of Jews in the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which was part of a series of decisions made in the summer of 1971 that the exhibit argues were part of the president's reaction and his overreaction. The panel suggested that we remove any reference to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This was handed to me. I looked at it and I said, I won't do it. I won't do this. Sorry. And I argued, and the archivist was there. I said, I'm not going to do this. There's no way. We have an obligation under the law to have abuse of governmental power, and this would be a cover-up. We would be furthering the cover-up once more. I said, we can't, and then I made an argument, but I didn't lose my cool, and then I wrote up the argument in a memo, and I won. Actually, I didn't win. History won. The archivist sided with me, and the panel disappeared. But it wasn't over, because there were people in Washington, the same people, I think, who made it possible for those materials in the 1990s not to be opened, who tried another approach. The Archivist of the United States supported the second draft. And the allies of, I don't know what, found a way to give a copy of the proofs of the exhibit to friends of the foundation. So I kept getting phone calls. What about this? Why is this there? Why is that there? Nitpicking every word. So we went through another. So again, if I had to make any substantive changes, I would have used other means to prevent it. I didn't. The fact of the matter is, my point here is that history, public history, is fragile. The coalition in support of real history in the federal space is fragile. If the public believes that left to its own devices, federal institutions will put straightforward public history in our museums, they are mistaken. And it is not because federal civil servants don't want to tell the truth, it's they're afraid to. The lobbies arrayed against telling hard truths about our country's past are so strong that our government, in this particularly partisan environment, would rather just take a pass. In this case, For a number of reasons, the government did not take a pass. The Archivist of the United States did the right thing. He opened the exhibit, thus anybody who knows Washington, putting his imprimatur on it. It happened. I'm proud of it. Civic literacy won over civic religion. But it was a near-run thing, and we all need to think hard about how we can help other people who want to do good public history. Thank you.
Does this story, and also does this story of Nixon's authorship of the original exhibit, it seems those are elements of history as well, and the struggle that you had as the director. Shouldn't those things also somehow be a part of the story that's recorded about Nixon? And then the second question, I'll give you both at once. In a time when private money is sacred in our national discussion, or seems to be sacred, and the idea that almost anything should or could be privately funded, you seem to make the argument that these things are almost incompatible, that if there's private funding in connection to the memory and the history of a major public figure, that there is a fundamental corruption there that is almost impossible to coexist between the public good and private funding.
Okay, quickly. One was when we took down the old exhibit, we preserved it. We took digital photographs of it, and you can visit the old exhibit. It's online. So it's been preserved. Yes, it's history, and I did not want to see that. I had studied so much Soviet history that I was not going to be engaged in removing Molotov from a picture. Two, this other question is really important. It's not that private money and a public good are incompatible. Look at the Miller Center. It's what people are donating for. This place is dedicated to excellence in the study and dissemination of nonpartisan history. This place rises and falls on its ability to maintain that high standard, and it's thriving. Presidential foundations collect money to defend the legacy of a president. That's a very different, that's a partisan approach. It's okay, it's allowed. We give money to presidents in elections because we prefer one person over another. That's part of our system. But I would argue the major tension, particularly with a controversial president, between the legacy project and the nonpartisan civic literacy project. They are in constant tension. I can remember when I was trying to prepare the docents for the new exhibit, and I felt, I said, I knew that the exhibit, the Docent Guild had a list of books to read, and they were discouraged from reading books outside of what the president had written, and a few pro-Nixon books. And there was some peer pressure on them not to read other books. And they were now working for a federal museum. And I said, you don't have to worry anymore. I said, I'm not going to tell you what to think, but you can read other things. Oh, no, 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 the president wouldn't want that. Well, the president was dead. So I did sessions with them where I played tapes. And I showed them documents, and I said, look, I'll leave it to you whether Richard Nixon was anti-Semitic. But you're going to have visitors because this library now doesn't just have the faithful. It's now public. You're getting everybody. There were people who weren't the faithful who used to come to the old exhibit, but they came because it was their version of the Liberace Museum, I think. But I said, they're going to come here knowing this about the president. I'm not asking you to debate with them, but know this, and know that there's a reason why they might believe this. The pushback I had, how dare you show the docents materials? You want them all to think he was anti-Semitic. Why are you showing this material? I had docents come up to me and said, you created that record, didn't you? We understand in Washington you have the ability to actually create tapes to make the president look bad. So what can you do after a while?
Amazing. Here, let's have a question here.
Mr. Naftali, thank you very, very, very much. I wish you have a couple of more hours for a discussion of this. I was a great admirer of Mr. Nixon, and Mr. Nixon could have gone down as one of the greatest presidents in this country. What caused Mr. Nixon to deny? Did you ever find out what caused him to deny this very basic thing that he did, which caused this whole uproar?
Okay, this is a dissertation. Let me do it very fast. The argument I made about the plumbers was not only that it was an abuse of governmental power that's in the House Judiciary Committee articles of impeachment which were passed by a bipartisan majority. Not a majority in the Republicans, but Republicans did support it. So I wanted to include everything that had been described by the House. But I also wanted to explain the cover-up. And the only way I think you can explain the cover-up is to know that what happened was there was an intermingling of funds. You had the people who had been involved in some dirty tricks campaign in '71 and in breaking into Dr. Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, who were also repurposed in 1972 for political espionage. They get arrested. Nixon, we know from the tapes, knew who Hunt was. E. Howard Hunt, the former CIA person. He and Colson talked about Hunt. It's on the tapes. He knew who it was. He could not deny knowing Hunt. So Hunt, if he talked, could tell about '71. There's still no evidence that Richard Nixon knew ahead about the break-in. Doesn't matter. There is evidence as long as the day about his knowledge of the dirty tricks in 1971 and about illegal actions. If Hunt talked, Nixon was finished. That's why it's a cover-up to cover up '71, more than '72. And then, of course, I will have to tell you that the president was the conceptualizer of many aspects of the cover-up. You can hear him on tape. I remember this moment. I played a tape of the president explaining to Ehrlichman how this fellow Jeb Magruder should testify, and said, you know, he's going to take the rap, but what he shouldn't say is that he knew about wiretapping ahead of time. And I played that for Justice Breyer when he visited the library, and he said, oh, obstruction of justice. So the evidence of the president, I think, is covering up for himself. And the other thing I'd have to say, and this is what was so disappointing about this experience intellectually, the evidence of abuses of governmental power, it's not a series of unique events. It's in the DNA of the president's view of the White House. And so if it wasn't one thing, it was going to be something else.
Tim, let's take a question from someone who has listened over the internet. This comes to us via Facebook from Kyle Lascaretz. I'm not sure where Kyle is, but he asks, do you think family members, administration loyalists should have a prominent role in the planning and presentation of that president's library?
That's a great... I think there should be a conversation. The argument I made to the Nixon family was no one will really believe the good things that you can say about his foreign policy if you're not willing to talk about Watergate. The credibility of the entire presentation rests on your willingness to deal with this. So I, for example, am a fan of the opening to China. And I can tell you that it was Richard Nixon and not Henry Kissinger. It's Nixon's idea. In fact, Kissinger had his doubts about it in the beginning. That's Nixon. He deserves credit. And when all else is said and done, he gets a gold star for that. He also deserves credit for a very progressive approach to Native Americans and ending the policy of termination, which is a policy of trying to drive them out of reservations and basically let them choose. And it's a policy that actually made him, in some quarters of Native America, he's as popular as Abraham Lincoln, in a sense. Those are things for which he deserves credit. His administration deserves credit for being one of the last good government Republican administrations. It's a commitment to the environment, all kinds of things that we should credit the administration. Not so much Richard Nixon, because he, as the tapes show, he didn't much like most of those things. But he was a good politician, and he understood the zeitgeist. But there are things he alone deserved credit for. Now, if you don't tell the truth about Watergate, who's going to believe the museum when it trumpets these other things? And that was the argument I tried to make. I didn't really succeed in getting them in persuading them. Now, of course, we did do this to the library, but I could make that argument to the person who did on the internet. I think it's an argument that could lead to real dialogue with presidents. But frankly, Nixon is different. He's the only president to resign. And so there is going to be a Nixon rehabilitation project that exists because of that, forever. And that makes him special. I don't think there's any president, save Herbert Hoover perhaps, who has to have such a defensive approach to history. Maybe George W. Bush, we will find out how that museum works itself out.
Thank you very much for that great presentation. I wanted to ask you a question about presidential libraries in general. I suspect you're familiar with a book by Benjamin Hufbauer called Presidential Temples.
Yes.
In which he actually makes the argument that all presidential exhibits, museums, etc., start out as a kind of temple euphoric approach, and that it's only the passage of time that allows for the exhibits to change. Actually, I think in his book, he uses the case of the Truman Library as a kind of excellent example of a presidential library that's made that change, that has taken on really some challenging issues. And he actually argues that most of the other presidential libraries have not really done that. So I'm wondering if the story you tell, as powerful as it is and amazing as your particular struggle to get the story out, whether that is in effect built into the DNA of presidential exhibits at presidential libraries, and whether you would therefore argue, if you agree with me, whether you would argue that maybe presidential libraries should not also be museums.
Great question. Before I left to take this job, which I was asked to take, my great concern was to preserve access and promote access to the tapes and to the documents. That was my first, I thought it was a privilege, given what I had done here, to have a chance to be on the other side to help get things open. The public history portion and museum portion of the job, while important to me, was secondary. What I learned, and I'm not in the job anymore, so I don't have a vested interest. I learned something really important about the way we teach history in the United States. Those of us, who go to grad school and become university professors, we lose touch sometimes with high schools. We lose touch with the elementary schools. And that's where most of our history happens. And the other place most of our history happens is in museums, because parents bring their kids to museums. And it's on the web now. I think we have to decide as a nation, and I know where I fall on this, whether we care whether our kids are historically literate or not. We really need more engineers. There's no doubt about it. But I think we also need civically literate people. I'll never forget listening to a group of Republicans, because I used to be invited to those groups, talk, and I actually have a number. In fact, this is a longer story, but there were a lot of good government Republicans who were very supportive of what I was doing. My troubles were with the partisan ones, the ones who would run campaigns. It was not, George Shultz, fantastic, and Paul O'Neill, and William Ruckelshaus, and Bobby Kilberg, and the fantastic, great public servants who have done things for this country, and they never get credit. Ruckelshaus got some, but a lot don't. And they were supportive of this. But here's the deal. You have 13 because the George W. Bush Library will open. They're in school districts that don't have a lot of money. This is a chance for local school teachers to actually deliver a little bit of high-value political history to the kids. Do we want to pass up that opportunity and let legacy organizations teach them lessons that I just described? That our president was the good one, the ones against him were bad, that when Democrats run the place, it's awful. Now then we move over to a Democratic library. When Republicans run the place, it's awful. Is that the kind of history we want to teach kids? See, I think you've got to take a stand in this country. And I took an oath to a constitution, not to a president. Now, if you're going to pay for a federal government, get a federal government. Our federal government on civil issues is so weak I'm not talking about national security issues. On civic, I bent over backwards not to impose a big foot. Bent over backwards, held people's hands, worked through these issues. But let me ask you, does it matter? I think it does. Do you want kids to grow up without knowing that presidents can use power to hurt them? Do you or not? Do you want them to think that all presidents are good? Do you want them not to know that they have a constitution that protects their liberties? Do you want them not to know this? And if you say, of course we don't, how do you want to teach them? And you got the federal government spending millions and millions of dollars on these places. Shouldn't they be better? Don't we have a missed opportunity? Now, why is it that they're the way they are? Although there are a number of good ones. So for example, the LBJ Library is redoing its museum, and they're involving historians. And the Franklin Roosevelt Museum added something about the internment of the Japanese and about the decision whether or not to bomb the railways to Auschwitz, and they involved outside historians. And of course, you mentioned Truman. So it's not that it doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen enough. But my question, my point is simply this. History is too valuable to understanding who we are, to leave it up to partisans, to leave it up to groups that are not pretending to give you the story. And that's okay. They're honest about what they're doing. They're absolutely honest about it. As the docents used to say to me, we're here to say only the good things about Richard Nixon. That's how they were trained. And they used to follow me around as I gave tours, writing down what I said, and then they would give this to the foundation, and then they would send a letter to Washington, and then Washington would say, what did you say? Why did you say that then? And it was okay, because I was committed to what I was doing. But the fact of the matter is, if you give up these places, and you centralize all documents in Washington, you lose the opportunity to interact with localities. And frankly, I'm not a Washington-centered person. One of the advantages of running a federal facility in another state is you realize how wonderful, what an effect you can have. And you look at what the Truman Library does with Kansas City schools. And you look at what the Eisenhower Library does with the schools of Abilene. It warms my heart. And what the George H.W. Bush does with not only Texas A&M, but that local area. But do it the right way. Be honest about our past. That's not easy. And Benjamin, I know Ben. I mean, and he wrote a nice review of the Watergate exhibit. I think it takes too long. I think this whole process is way too long. It takes years for it to happen. I mean, look at the Iran-Contra exhibit in the Reagan Library. It's just a speech for the most part. Mistakes were made. Passive voice. Reminds me of Pravda. I mean, really, the fact is, now, the partisans would say that presidents all deserve a place where, as one of them said to me, a watering hole where the faithful can come together. I would argue not where you have documents, because I felt the library director wears two hats. One is the head of the museum and one is the head of the archive. How do you know, as a scholar, that the person responsible for that historically inaccurate and partisan display is not mecking around with the documents? They're the same person. I think the credibility of our access to information depends on transparency on both sides of these buildings, and I think our government should be more interested in public history. Now it's a matter of money, and this is my last point. I could never say this when I was a federal official because you can't lobby Congress. Congress has made, I think, the wrong decision. It's a halfway measure. Congress doesn't want to pay for these libraries. So what they're asking is their foundations to pay more. They're asking foundations to invest more into these places. Well, listen, if I'm a legacy fundraiser, why would I want to give the National Archives any control, real control, as opposed to statutory control over the exhibits? I paid for this place. So if we decide public history matters, we have to pay for it. I think we should pay for it. It's not a lot of money. I was able to run my programming. The foundation had warned me they were going to use leverage to prevent me doing this. But I was very entrepreneurial, and when they were negotiating the deal with the foundation, I was a consultant. I made sure I could raise money. I also changed the nature of the split between the foundation and the federal government. I wanted 50% of all the revenue. I raised a fund which I used for public programming and paid for part of the Watergate exhibit. Okay? Do it. It doesn't cost a lot of money. It doesn't cost a lot of money to run programs. But make it part of the job description of the director. Because it wasn't part of my job description. Make nonpartisan programming something you expect of these organizations, and it will happen. It's not that expensive to do. Thanks.
Let's make a little more time. We'll have another question.
Okay, this may be a follow-on from things you've said, but you mentioned the LBJ Library, and I visited that recently, and having done so, I came out with a much more positive view of LBJ than I had as a college student in the 60s, anti-war. So it seems to me from what you said, the first question I should have asked is, who funded this library? And that might give you some idea of how it's oriented. And secondly, though, even if it is federally funded, I'd still ought to have some skepticism about the accuracy of its presentation. Is that a fair? So going into a library, what kind of questions should you ask?
Well, now that's a great point. And I think humility, as I said, my first attempt was to be extraordinarily humble and to disappear and have the narrative disappear. I would leave it up to you to see whether this is an overhanded, whether the federal government has overreached in doing. A lot of it is laying out the evidence, but leaving the structuring in a chronological way without a heavy-handed interpretation. There are only the few places where we have interpretation are where crimes were committed, and we wanted kids to know, for example, that it's illegal to discriminate against people on the basis of religion or race. When we talk about Richard Nixon's order that they should find out how many Jews there were in the federal government and get their names. But the beauty of this is the footnotes are there. I think humility is important. We were replacing a museum that wasn't humble at all. As I said, it had the voice of God. I think public history, what makes it really exciting, is that it's hard. And there's no one way of doing it right. It's worth the effort, though. And you know what? This is what's nice. We have a marketplace of ideas. If you've got an exhibit that pretends to be public history and it turns out to be bad, hey, we got a blogosphere. We got people who can talk about it. We people who can write and say this is wrong. That's what makes us great. What I worry about is a situation where you have frozen history, which is designed to force a particular interpretation. And that's what you get with legacy, often you get with legacy organizations. Now, what I love about the LBJ Library and all the other libraries that are really grappling with this issue, is that they are coming to the conclusion that openness says more about their president. The very fact of it says good things about the president. A president that is lets history be presented with the bark off, as LBJ said, that president is self-confident, and that those people who support that president are self-confident. And that says good thing. When a president and his supporters are unwilling to let history judge, what does that say about what they know about what they did? So I think transparency is itself a good that is helpful to presidential reputation for most of them. Now, if you've got a bad president, okay, we still need access to their documents. Congress decided that Richard Nixon was such a bad president that Washington would hold on to his documents. That changed. He's no longer a Roger Maris. He no longer has a Roger Maris library. But what you have to decide is if, first of all, will the nation conclude that the president is bad? Often it's a partisan judgment. So how do you ensure that a place not be defensive and be committed to openness? And I just say that if the public is engaged, and I'm not naive, how many people really care? But I think a lot of people think this is happening. Phyllis, you know Ben's book. How many people know Ben's book? I mean, Ben is really good at this, Ben Hofbauer. The fact of the matter is, a lot of people don't know. In fact, most of the people that I interacted with, because I did lots of events, said to me, oh, we didn't know the federal government ran these museums. We thought they were all private. I said, it's your money paying for it. They hadn't a clue. Because they'd walk into these organizations and they'd say, oh, well, this must be done by the private family because, So I think you have to decide, do you want them or not? I've given you the argument for wanting to spread nonpartisan history because it has a social good. But it's something the public has to decide. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim.